As we do, I will jump right in so that we don't miss a minute. Sharing screen. Let's see here. I'm going to do screen number 2. There we go. That should be it. So this is a recap from last week, from week number 3. And this is a way for you to check to see, where you are in the program, how comfortable you are with what you've learned, if you've come far enough. I'm spending a little extra time today. We're sort of coming up on the halfway mark, I guess sometime between, halfway through next time. And so I just want to make sure that people aren't falling behind. I know there's a lot of materials, but you are learning what it might take years to do otherwise in a way to make you fluent, not perfect in the language. In other words, conversational, not being able to write poetry in this new language. But being able to order a nice meal at a nice restaurant will be a nice thing to be able to do in astrology. That's the purpose, to not be afraid of the complexity of it, and to just be comfortable enough that you know what you're looking at and can start a journey of much more detailed learning that is much more fun when you know the basics. In other words, it's more fun to travel through a country if you know enough to get along with people or to order your own meals than it is if you know nothing. So it's just about giving you the tools to move forward, not to be expert astrologers. That's just not possible in 9 weeks. So this is the recap. Look at this. This is what you should know now from last week, and you should be comfortable with all these things. The archetypal spectrum is hugely important. This will come up many, many times. These are important pieces of the work. Today we're in week 4. Last week we looked at the planets. Today we're looking at their relationships between them. You should have a really good sense of the planets now. I'm hoping you did those collages. That would be very helpful as a way to get to know them better. And today we are looking at aspects. So the key learning for today is to understand how planets relate to each other, because I told you we're in a play. This is a theater, your internal theater, and we want to know how who is basically today. We're asking, as we know, there's characters on your stage. Who's kissing whom? Who's slapping whom? Who's stabbing whom? What's the drama that's unfolding on your inner play? And we get that in any play from the relationships between the characters. They're very important. Nobody is an island upon themselves. None of these characters show up on their stage without the other, without the others. They are always connected with others in some way, shape, or form. So again, at the end, this is what I want you to be thinking about at the end today. So I'm just putting it out there. So what I'm really curious about, I'm putting it there now. I want you to focus on the class, but I want you to have this in the back of your mind, and I'll come back to these at the end before we go into Q&A. How are you doing with the materials? Where are you lost or confused? How much time are you spending studying outside class? Is that enough? Is that not enough for you? Are you able to follow? When you look at a chart, is it less overwhelming now? These kinds of things is what I want to know. EBIs, that's for me, that's a term we use when we work with leadership, basically meaning what would be, it's a way to give feedback. It would be even better if, are there any suggestions you have to make it better than what it is now? So that's just where we're going to go at the end with the questions. So once again, excuse me, with the layers, last time we talked about the first layer. Today we're talking about the second layer, which is the relationships that these actors make with each other. Relationships in astrology are shown by lines between these planets on the circle, and these are called aspects. Aspects comes from the word aspectare, which is Latin to see. And so we just make it simple and take 2 actors on the stage. How are they seeing each other is the question that we're asking. Think about it when you think about seeing. You walk down an alley at night and you look at the person coming towards you. One false look could be dangerous. Does the person give you the evil eye? Does it cause you to be, stabbed? Is this drama? Is this complete, ignoring you? What is the relationship that is established when 2 planets see each other? This is what we're asking. Is it love at first sight? And so some of the things we can just think about is that it's going to matter who's involved. If one is a Republican and one is a Democrat and they're talking politics, there's going to be some tensions. But if one is a dancer and the other one is a musician, and they're talking about the arts, they're relating about the arts, that's probably going to be quite friendly. So start to think about the quality of the relationship based upon the quality of the actors that are on the stage. But we're now talking about relationships. So how are they seeing each other is the question that we're asking, aspectare. So this gets a little bit technical. I'll go through this as quickly as I can. I'm respectful that not everybody wants to do math. And I will start by saying that everything I'm going to show you now is that you have the basic understanding of how this works. I want you to have that. I don't want you to blindly put in stuff into the computer and have no clue what's coming out. That's the ego thing, the garbage in, garbage out. I do want you to have a sense of how this works, but you don't have to do what I'm showing you now with a calculator or by hand the way I did, and I'll show you how I used to do it so you see how far we've come with computers. And I'll show you that for a couple of reasons. But you need to understand what the computer does. Otherwise, you can't really use it right. Last time I showed you the ephemeris. You don't need to know how to use the ephemeris, but you need to understand how the computer puts a planet on the circle based on the ephemeris that the computer calculates. It doesn't have the tables, it does the math to get to the tables. So same idea here. So any 2 points on a circle will have an angle between them if you draw lines from where they're standing, if they're standing on the edge. And of course, that's the ground rule in astrology. The actors are always moving around the edge of the stage or the circle. It's a circular stage. And so any 2 points, if you draw up into the middle of the stage, have an angle between them. We can measure their distance as an angle. To simplify this, because if all the lines between all the relationships with all the planets would go, into the middle, it would make a mess in the middle of the chart. So to simplify this, as astrologers, we just draw a line between them, and that line signifies that relationship. That's why on the graphic that I just showed you that was moving, you only saw lines, not to the middle. And so this is how we demonstrate this 74-degree angle between them would be this line, but would indicate that. So in this case, this is a relationship of 74 degrees. That's what this line would mean. Only certain angles are important. 74 happens not to be important. So I'm crossing that one out. It's not, I should have put a degree mark here, but basically this is not a degree that we care about. There are only 6 degrees between, maybe it's 6 degrees of separation. Never thought of that. In my way of doing it, there are 6 degrees that matter between, or 6 aspects that matter. The first one is the conjunction. Sorry. First one is the conjunction, yes, where the planets are basically in the same place. If they're standing in the same place, this is called a conjunction. 0 degrees apart. If they are exactly across from each other, then that's called an opposition. They are 180 degrees apart. That's a very important one. They're all important, the ones I'm showing you here. If they're 90 degrees apart, that's called a square. And as you can see, 74 is not on this list. If they're 120 degrees apart, that's called a trine. So someone says, my Venus is trining my Jupiter. You now know what that means. My Venus is trining my Jupiter. There's a trine between my Venus and my Jupiter, 120-degree aspect. It's a description of a relationship. Next one is the sextile, 60 degrees apart. And finally, the quincunx, 150 degrees apart. All of these together are the 6 angles that we use in my way of doing astrology. And I want you to know it's not my way, it's sometimes these are called the classical aspects or the traditional aspects. There are others. There are many others. There's people who it's basically based on division of the circle. So as you can notice here, if you divide, we've done divisions of the circle before. The trine reminds us of the elements, right? Um, and so and the square reminds us of the modes, and the fixed. I'm sorry, the other way around. The square reminds us of the elements, and the trine reminds us of the modes. It's 120 degrees between between the modes. So, for instance, and fixed is a square. I'm saying this backwards. The 90 degrees reminds us of the modes, fixed, 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 fixed. Remember that? And the trines is earth, earth, and earth. The trines give us the elements. If it's a similar division. But let's separate those two. You memorize that for that class. For this class, just know that the relationships between the planets are also based on divisions of this 360. So 180 is a division in 2, 90 is a division in 4, and so on. So these are the elements that matter. But you can also divide the circle into 7. You can divide the circle into 5. You can divide the circle into weird numbers. The only one that is a little weird here is the 150 because it doesn't go directly. I use those of you who've taken classes with me before the master classes, you know that I use the quincunx. I find it very effective and I find it useful. So I'm adding that, and many traditional astrologers like myself use the quincunx in addition to these very classical ones up here, even though it doesn't quite fit the same math thing. So these 6 are the ones I want you to memorize. And again, you can do a lot of other things and it can get complex very quickly. There's septiles, there's semi-squares, there's square and a half, there's all kinds of weird stuff. Don't get bogged down with it. It doesn't help. It doesn't give you anything in my mind that this won't give you. So in real time, of course, angles are being formed all the time, every single second. All the planets between any two in the sky, there's angles. Some of them are going to be, so the ones that are shown here are the ones that are one of those that I just told you from that list of 6. But there's many, many more that are going on at all times. You could do the math on the probability of any angle showing up at any time and so on. That gets really complex, not necessary. I just want you to know that we're taking a select group of relationships that are important of all the possible ones, because that would be thousands and thousands. Each aspect has a symbol, right? Now you happen to already know this if you've done your homework because they are listed right down here on this sheet. And I want you to know these symbols and I want you to memorize these symbols. They're very important. You will need them to understand and be able to look at anything, even basic, in a chart. So each aspect has a symbol, as I showed you here. Each angle also has a quality. What does it mean? So that I'm going to spend a little time on this because this is important. So when two planets are in the same place, I gave you the example of, one of the two politicians, one being a Republican, one a Democrat, standing in the same place. So it depends who is here in the conjunction. You can think of the conjunction theatrically as the stage director. If you've ever been on an actual stage, you know that the director or somebody, maybe the lighting engineer, puts pieces of tape on the stage so the actors know where to stand for their scene. And it might be for a fight scene or for the lighting or for so that everybody can see them from the back corners of the set or whatever. So we know that there's a position to stand. So imagine if someone put a piece of tape on the stage and then told 2 actors to go stand there. That's what a conjunction is. They're sharing a square foot of the stage. So think about that. They have to work together. They can't work alone. And every time one of them moves, the other one is going to move as well. You could think of it as walking or running a 3-legged race. They're tied together at the thigh. They can't be separated. We have to think of them together. And so it starts to create something in our imagination that we can't just look at this person's sun. We have to think of this sun, S-U-N, in context with Saturn, because this person's sun and Saturn is literally standing in the same place on the stage. What does that do to your imagination? How do you start wondering about what that would be like? And it happens the best when you start to embody the planets as we've done last week, begun. And you can imagine what that would feel like as that actor if you had someone there right next to you sharing the same space. That would be an important thing to change the behavior of both. Again, if one's a dancer and one's a musician, they're talking about the arts, that's going to be an easy combination and they'll sort of help each other. They're not going to, challenge each other or tackle each other or fight with each other all the time. How do we work that into our personalities when we have these kinds of stories going on in us? So it depends who's there is what you need to memorize for the conjunction. The 180 opposition is what's called maximum tension, or I think of it as hyperfocus. Why is it maximum tension? Very practically, we can use physics to understand that. If I'm standing on the circle someplace, and you start walking. You and I are both on the stage. I stand still somewhere in my position. Again, we're always at the edge of the stage. And you start walking from next to me, and we're holding a long rubber band between us. The further you walk away from me, the more tension is going to be on that rubber band. When you get to the 180 position, exactly across from me, we have maximum tension on this rubber band. If you keep walking, you come closer to me again on the other side, and the tension reduces. Therefore, the greatest tension, you can think of it literally like that, is we've pulled it apart as far as we can. Thermodynamics, laws of thermodynamics teaches us that potential energy increases when you separate two objects. And so there is this tension between them that is increased. The energy between them is increased. There's some interesting things about the opposition. You're facing the other straight on. Sometimes I think of it as two actors holding a sword under each other's throats. It's the maximum tension. It's the maximum, what are we going to do with this situation? Are we going to kill each other? We're going to figure out a way to get along. Are we going to work together? How are we going to resolve this situation? We have to face each other, literally. The language helps us a lot with these things. Um, I read once somewhere that a mouse, when confronted by a snake, stays alive as long as it stares the snake straight in the eyes. It's like they've got a perfect opposition going on. The minute the mouse looks away, it's gone. The snake, eats it up. So there's something in that tension that is very powerful. It's a hyper focus on that situation. We cannot ignore oppositions in a chart. They are hugely important. And we will talk more about some of these things in context to looking at charts as we go along, but I want you to have a core understanding of the quality of these relationships. Next one is the square. Square is often described in astrological literature as a hurdle, something that someone has to overcome. Sort of like until you get a handle on that square between your so and so and so and so, you're kind of stuck in that problem. It's like you're going to fall over it again and again until you figure out a way to do something with it. Um, I once learned a term back in Switzerland, which I kind of like, which is that the square is the perfect position to slap someone if they're 90 degrees away from you. If I'm standing here and the other person is 90 degrees away from me, if I reach out with my right hand and they're to my right, I can slap them. Sometimes squares feel like slaps. They come out of nowhere and boom. I didn't know that this would knock me over. So again, it's a different kind of relationship. Another way to um, sort uh, these aspects is by calling the 180 and the 120, calling the trine and the opposition major aspects and the square and the sextile minor aspects. And so that's why I call it maximum and also maximum harmony here, which is the next one. And so the trine is maximum harmony. If the other is maximum tension, trine is maximum harmony. Kumbaya is what I call it. I'm not a big fan of trines. Books go all crazy, and somebody might have a grand trine, which is, having three planets that are in a perfect triangle to each other. So there's a trine, then another trine, and then a third trine between all three. Um, I consider that, I'm a fan of, if you've ever had a reading with me, I'm a fan of tension because that's where the work is. And harmony is a little bit like kumbaya. I like you. No, I like you more. No, you're great. No, you're even greater. Let's hug. And nothing ever really happens. Everybody's just happy and friendly. And there's just not a lot of, sure, it's nice to have trines, but it's not as useful if we want to learn things in life and get along with life. Tension is much more useful, which is another reason never to say I have a bad chart. You might have a chart full of tension. So what are you doing with it is my answer, is my question back to you. So there's creative potential is much greater with tension than with harmony. And then we have the small harmony, the minor aspect, again, major and minor. And it's basically just harmony. It's a relationship between planets. I don't, pay a lot of, it's kind of a support. It's like a nice supporting. I have some support from over here. It's a place I can go if I need some help. That kind of a thing is what the sextile can give me. I don't pay too much attention to sextiles that much. Quincunx is a learning. It's kind of neutral. It's where we can learn something important between two planets. There is always some kind of a lesson. There is something that has to be integrated. It's a little bit a mixture between, an opposition and a trine. Therefore, it's considered neutral. But there's something that I have to learn here. I cannot ignore this. You can't ignore a quincunx. Some people have more than, one of these, of any of these, of course. But sometimes we have to just recognize that there is just something we can't overcome that quickly. We have to learn about it. I have an exact quincunx. It's the closest aspect in my chart, which is maybe another reason why I like them, because I know a lot about the experience of having a Sun and Uranus quincunx, which I have, which means, my sense of me, my inner sovereign, and my inner rebel are learning something from each other that's very, very, very central in my life, all of my life. So I get this one, and I'm learning something about the putting those two together. So it's a lesson, something to learn. So the 180 degree, for instance, as an example, we know is an opposition. That we now know. That's fine. That's 180 degrees. If you actually look at charts, planets are probably at the moment of your birth not going to be exactly 180 degrees apart. What if they're 176 degrees apart or 185 degrees apart? Is that still an opposition? Does that still count? How do we determine that? Oh, I got to turn this off here. Let's see, hide floating. There we go. Um, how do we turn that off? No, how we turn that. How do we just decide if that is still valid or not? And this is where we need the term orbs. And this is something you'll learn this time and hopefully memorize because this is important. The orb, basically, an orb is the number of degrees by which an aspect may vary from what I just gave you, those six, and still be in effect. The orbs are also, like a lot of things in astrology, debated. Some people say, oh, the orb must be much tighter. Some people say the orb must be much greater because, oh, that's absolutely still in effect. Even at 170 degrees, that 180 is still in effect because those two are looking at each other cross-eyed across that stage. They don't like each other, and there's much greater lenience or bigger orbs. That's what that means. I think it's still valid, somebody might say, even at 170 degrees, even if they're not exactly across from each other and things like that. And this also gets into daily astrology, as in what's going on in the sky. So and so Pluto is opposing the sun today, somebody might say, but that may be off by several degrees, but they may still feel it for several days after, all these kinds of things. All of that is based on orbs. What is the number of degrees that is still valid for this aspect to be in effect? Okay. How do we know what the orbs are? So I pulled up my old table. This is my handwritten notes from 1977 when I was 16. And when I learned how to do this. So you notice a couple of things here. First, you have more, here you have the classic ones I'm teaching you, the conjunction, the opposition, the trine, the square, the sextile. The quincunx is also, I'm sorry, and then the quincunx is here. This one is called the quincunx, the 150. So here you have the degree numbers, easier to recognize. See, at that time, I was taught to also use other ones, a 30 degree, a 45 degree, and 135 degrees. They have these symbols. If you ever see them, you can come back to this class and I know what that is. You don't need them. We're not going to use them. You can do astrology for decades without ever using them and do really fine work. You do not need them. Again, it's just I have found less is more. And this last line we don't need right now. But basically, what this means here is that planets have orbs depending on which planet it is. So you see that the sun has the biggest orb. Um, and the Jupiter has a pretty big orb too, but Pluto has really small orbs and so on. So this is a table. All of this I programmed into Solar Fire. Solar Fire comes with presets that you might accept and say, yeah, that's fine. But otherwise, you can take this table and make it exactly like this. If you want to have the charts to look exactly like mine, you can do that, or pick anyone else you want to follow, or your own way of what you think works. This is individual, but I'm showing you how it can be done so that your charts look like mine. You put in these orbs into the program, and you would skip this whole line except the quincunx. And then, and so here's how it then works. Again, you don't have to know this, But so you now look at a point, you look at two planets on a chart. This is how I did it by hand when I was learning. And then you say, okay, this looks like it's a square. Because if you count here, each one of these is 30. So 30s, so 30, 60, 90. Yep. Are these a square? Well, you count the actual degrees between them and you see it's 80, they're 84 degrees apart. We know a square is 90. So is this still a square or not? How do I know? Well, then you do this math. The planets involved are Mercury and Pluto. The orb for Mercury again, you do not have to know this, but I want you to know how it's done. The orb for Mercury for a square is 6 degrees. We get that from the table. Here we go. Mercury for a square, the orb is 6 degrees. For Pluto, it's 4 degrees, though, for a square. Okay, so we go for Pluto, then we average the orb. So 6 plus 4 divided by 2 is 5. So a square between Mercury and Pluto is valid between 85 and 95 degrees. But instead of 90, we can go up 5 degrees to 95 or down 5 degrees to 85. And then we can say this square is out of orb and not valid. So this is not a square because it's only 84 degrees. Imagine doing that for every two planets on the stage, between every couple. That takes a while. That's why it took me 4 hours to do charts by hand. So that's what the computer does. It does it for you, and it just ends up showing you what it is. But now we can also, and I showed you this in an earlier class, and I'm just coming back to it, that the computer can be shown with what's called aspect highlighting to show me the difference between an aspect that is 179 degrees and 184 degrees. They're both within orb, otherwise they wouldn't be there. Remember, the computer's already decided, yes, this is an opposition. It's based on my orb definitions. It's told me, yes, this is an opposition. But is it one that's close, like the first one, or is it one that's not close? First one could also be 180 and some minutes, degrees and minutes. But this is handy to know. So it shows me the difference with a thing you can turn on in Solar Fire called aspect highlighting. And so these are two that are exactly the same, two charts that are the same. This one is what you look at. You don't really see what's important here right away. They're the same charts, but this one has turned on aspect highlighting. Look at the difference. Thicker means closer to the actual orb. So this one is much more intense. I can see from 10 feet away that there's this Moon-Uranus opposition, Uranus here, Moon here, opposition, is within 1 degree. If it's within 1 degree, then my line thickness is this fat. I've told the computer to do it like that. So I can see very, very quickly what's important in this chart. That Moon-Uranus opposition is going to dominate that story. It doesn't really matter what else is going on. Maybe you remember earlier in the lecture, I talked about standing in the middle of a field with your arms stretched apart and having a candle in each arm, and it's dark, and the light in your life is the light from those candles. And if I drive up in front of you with a truck and shine the light of the truck into your face, the light of the candles doesn't matter so much. I think of that the same way here. This is the truck. This is the truck light that shines in your face. This is what's important in this chart. This is intense energy. This here, sure, Mars-Pluto opposition is no small thing. We'll certainly talk about it. Those are the candles. Certainly also relevant, but this is way, way more relevant. So we can immediately start to get some sense of importance in charts that have that. If you don't have this capacity, if your program can't do it, then in this case, you would have to look at this and you would have to recognize that this is 25 degrees and this is 26 degrees, and you could recognize, oh, this is within 1 degree. This is very close. But you have to do much more, and you can say, well, this is 29 and this is 3 into the other sign, so this is 4 degrees apart. This is much less tight. You can see it right away. You can't. So this is my little pitch for aspect highlighting because it really helps you to read a chart very quickly. Many programs don't do that. I'm not sure that the free ones can do it. You can also go back yourself, of course, with a marker and just draw the lines thicker that you think are important. If they're within 1 degree, make them really thick. And then here the blue ones are also thicker than these because these are also very close. This one is 29 degrees for Mercury, and this one is 29 degrees for Mars. So these are exactly 120 apart. So that's this fat blue line up here, the top one. This is all within orb. This is what the computer tells me, that they are within orb. That's a term you want to know. They are within orb when the computer shows them, because I've told the computer, show me only what's within orb. Don't show me the other stuff. The 74-degree ones, etc. Don't show me those. Only what's within orb. All right. So if you see a chart that looks different from one that you get from me or from, from someone else, or that you create yourself or something like that, if it looks different because it has too few or too many aspects, then check that the orbs that were used, because most likely that's the reason. Almost for sure that's the reason. So it does make charts look different. And to get clarity, we want to make sure that we use similar orbs. And again, we can discuss this, and sometimes I break my own rules and I jump ahead and I give a larger berth of the orb that I accept and so forth. It just depends. But I want you to have the rules, the basic rules. You can only break rules if you first know them. Right now, we want to know the rules, what they are. These are the ones I learned, and these are the ones that work really, really well. So let's stick with these for now, and then we can talk about breaking them later on. So do you note, are there aspects that go to, for instance, the ascendant? So here I pulled up an old chart from the 70s. Um, and you can see here that this is hand drawn. And so the lines between the charts in those times, I made the lines a little bit more curved because my teacher taught me to do them like that. They weren't straight lines. It looked a little nicer, a little bit more life in them by making them curved, but it's the same idea. It's a point between. But this line here for Mercury goes to the ascendant. So are there aspects to the angles? Or what about this one? Uranus is making a sextile to the midheaven. Is that Does that make sense? Are there aspects to the angles? Or what about the nodes, which we haven't talked about yet? But in this case, there's a line here from Mercury going to the north node. We don't know what the nodes are yet, but they're just points you want to recognize for now. We'll talk about those later. But they're like the angles. They are points. And by the way, I may have failed to mention that these points are called angles as well, these four. I know I mentioned them. We spent some time talking about these points, but the ascendant, the IC, the descendant, the MC, but they're a term that I should have mentioned is that they're called angles. That's why I'm bringing it in here, the angles. And so do aspects to angles matter as they did here? So my answer is no, they make no sense. At that time, back in the 70s, and this again is debated. You'll find other astrologers say something else, but I'm talking about my experience and why it makes no sense to me. I see the planets as actors on a stage. So you can have a relationship to a point, to a place on the stage. This is a place. The ascendant is a place it's a point on the circle. So is this. It's a point on the circle. You can't really have a relationship with a point. The North Node is a sign or a place. It's not a planet. It's not an actor. There's nothing alive. So these places are not alive. And so, sure, you could talk about a one-way relationship, like I'm looking at it, or I'm staring at it, or I'm frowning at it. Sure. But in the context of looking at this as an inner drama, an inner theater, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I'm going to say no. I don't use them. I haven't used them for many, many decades. And as you can see, this is still pretty freaking messy and not so easy to read, even for me today. I look at this and I say, wow, I was really spaghettiing up my charts, much like that guy in the picture I just showed you before. So it makes no sense to me. I don't use them. Exception is the conjunction of course. Planets on angles are strongly emphasized. Any planet that's on an angle is very strong, but it's not making a relationship with that place. It's just there. So it just means that it has an importance of being in a place that we've already determined is important. So any planet that's on an angle is strongly emphasized. That's a ground rule in astrology that is absolutely key that you need to know. And this S should not be capitalized. Okay. So look at the difference. I'm going to show you the same chart the way I would draw it today. I took literally the exact same data and just put it into Solar Fire, and it looks like that. So I don't think one could argue that this is not much easier to decipher from far away, just plain from how much stuff is on the stage. Like in this one here, um, because I was using these weird little aspects, this half square, this 45-degree, and this square and a half, so you get all these other relationships that are precise, but it doesn't help in the understanding of the chart. This for me is way, way easier to read than this. The importance of the sun, Neptune isn't strong enough. It doesn't stand out enough. This relationship between the sun and moon is very strong that we can see here too. That's the thick blue line. And the sextile between Neptune and the moon is also very precise. We can see that. That's big. So we get everything that we get here, but we get much more because we don't get a lot of the extra stuff here. There's no mess going up to here. There's no mess going to here. With time, you'll be able to do these kinds of relationships to the ascendant if you do want to do that in your head. I don't have to write it down. I can do that in my head and see, oh, there's a relationship, here between the ascendant and Saturn, or between Jupiter and Saturn, for instance. Um, Sorry, between Jupiter and the ascendant here, they're 150 degrees apart. I can see that in my head, but drawing it out would not make this chart clear in my mind. And there's never any lines going to the nodes in my new charts. It's just, to me, that's a whole other story we will talk about. No lines go there. I think of them as separate from the rest of the chart, which we will talk about when we talk about the nodes. So less is more. I encourage you to put less in your charts. I think you will get more out of it. Looking at all these old charts made me a little nostalgic, and I started to think about my teacher. And so I just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge him. His name was, I called him Tontaine. He was a family friend. This is him in his 90s. He lived to be 102. And my parents met him in India in 1952 or so, when there were in Kashmir in northern India, when there were no Europeans going to India. And he was there on a sort of a spiritual trip. He was also an architect, and I wonder many times if that was part of my inspiration to become an architect as well. So he was an architect, and he worked up there with people with houses and helping them build. He spoke Hindi pretty well. Kashmiri is actually the language that they speak there. And then he would come and stay with us for many months at a time. And he never had any money, and he was just this very interesting, eccentric person, and a dreamer, and he was a professional astrologer and a good friend of my parents. And so, I found one of his many quotes: "Everything one resists creates tension." That's a good one for us to remember here in the class. But just a little shout out to my teacher, who taught me basically, a lot of what I'm teaching you. And I think we need to honor our teachers. I, of course, have learned a lot since then, and some of the things I learned I have added on to. One would hope that, but still, this is the foundation and where it came from. This is a picture taken in the early 2000s, maybe, in Oxford, in the UK, where he lived at the end of his life with his daughter. He was from Holland originally. All right, so another very important term. Sometimes, if we look at this chart, what do we notice that is a little bit different? We have here all of these planets are relating to each other. This one to this one, this one to that one. On this inner circle, we have these lines that show us the relationships. Where is this? The planets have a marking on the inner circle, and then there's a line going away from it, which means it has a relationship. So Pluto is relating to Mercury over here with this quincunx. Jupiter is conjunct Pluto over here, and so on. So you see these different relationships very strongly. But if you look at this one has no relationships to anybody. That is called an unaspected or unseen planet. It's not relating to anyone else on the stage. I put a lot of emphasis on unaspected planets. If you have planets in play, the Orange Book, there's a little piece in there on unaspected planets and what they mean, but I'll give you the summary here. The important recognition is that often, and there can be more than one, by the way, I think Steve Martin has seven, if I remember correctly. He's one of the celebrities, famously having very few aspects between his planets. And so, but particularly when there's one, it's much more important than if there are two or three or four, because it kind of dilutes the idea. Like then there's several things you have to keep in mind. But with one actor that's unaspected to the other, to anyone else on the stage, what we have is a this often becomes the most important lesson that the person is learning about. This becomes the story. This particular case, I looked up this person. This was a client back in the 90s, I think, who this is Venus, the lover, of course, who had huge learnings about relationships. He had a wife, he had a kid. He said to me, the quote that I wrote down was, "I can't find my inner lover through my spouse." And which is a classic moon Venus. We won't get into interpretations right now, but if you look at his moon situation, which is incredibly complex as well, moon right here with Neptune, this was a very difficult situation for relationships for him. But this was manifested in this longing for having a better relationship to Venus that he didn't quite know how to find. And so this is a classic example of that becoming the key. This became his obsession, became his life. Yes, successful businessman, blah, 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 blah. He did all of that as well. But his big story was his inner longing to connect with his Venus. And so I've seen it many, many times. The way we can think of this, imagine that these actors all have their names on a marquee outside of the state of the theater where your play is performing. If there's an unaspected planet, that actor's name moves up on the marquee to a higher place, maybe even to the top. It just becomes more important, has more prominence. It's like that becomes much more of a lead actor. Maybe it is the lead actor of the play. I immediately wonder if someone has an unaspected planet, if that's the main story that they're learning about, and if that's why they're here to see me. My first thought, if someone has an unaspected planet, that's where I go because I put a lot of emphasis on these. Not a lot of astrologers do in the same way, but I've had a lot of success with this, and I think it's a good tool to teach because it's very, very effective and useful, especially if there's just one. So that's what an unaspected planet is. So we're going to start just with very brief synthesis, because now we have enough tools to start to look at the stage in a more rich, meaning-making way, not just, who is here or what is this. We can now say, what does this mean? We can start to do it. We're not certainly not there yet, but we can start to do it. And I know that's why most of you are going to be here, not for the math or the angles or the theory, but how do I apply this? So I want you to think about, you know, actors on a stage. I want you to think about embodying them as you do any of this work. And the way you feel what they mean embodied for you is why you did all is what you get from the images that you did, the collages hopefully, and the keywords that you have. That starts to trigger something in you. When you hear Mars, maybe you start to feel rage or great passion in your belly. When you think of Venus, you start to think of something sweet that you'd like to eat right now, or your long lost love, or something like that. How are you, and what does that do to your body? It's very important to understand that archetypes are embodied. They are not a theory or something floating around in your head. This is an embodied experience, and they're all physically there. You can change your physical stance and become more aware of an archetype. You can choose to embody them more. If you get into a fighting stance, you're much more in a martial place than if you put on a nice outfit because you're going out on a date. So we embody these all the time in a very literal way. And so as we start to do the synthesis of putting all this complexity, all these different parts together in a chart and start to talk about what is going on between the planets, I want you to think about these interactions as embodiments. So let's take an example just of the sun and the moon. Simple one. And we do need to think of them as, a little bit more important than other planets. They are called the lights. They are at the top of that circle. They only show up that I showed you of rulership. They only show up once with the sun ruling Leo and the moon ruling the Cancer. So let's just use them as a simple example. You can think of your own chart. And this is not anything about houses. This is not anything about stuff we haven't covered yet. This is stuff based on what we have covered. So the sun and the moon in your chart are going to be in a sign. And they're going to be, and we're not going to do the signs yet. We haven't done the signs. So we're going to think of them differently, just as who they are. So the sun, let's say your inner sovereign, your inner sense of me, your radiant self, what you project out into the world is, hey, here's who I am. That part of you. And the moon is, sort of like what gives the light is the sun, what gives your light, and the moon is what reflects the light of others. The moon doesn't have any light of her own. If you think of the moon in the sky, she gets her light from the sun. It's a reflection. And so what the moon does is it takes in and reflects and feeds back and absorbs kind of the energy from the other. And so let's say the sun and the moon in your chart are standing next to each other. What does that feel like? Does that feel like that the sun is overpowering the moon? And by the way, that's a new moon is when the sun and the moon are conjoined. That happens once a month. That's called a new moon. And when the moon is full, is this when the sun and the moon are in opposition. It's just a little bit of astronomy on top of the astrology. And so, does that sun and the moon give you a sense of that they're in harmony? Does it feel like they're in tension? Are they not relating to each other at all? What does that mean? One is doing her thing over here, and the other one is doing his thing over there. And I'm using gender pronouns here, even though sun and the moon, no archetypes are gendered, but it's just easier to think of them that way because we're more used to it. And if you want to call them, that's fine too. Basically, this part of you that is solar, this part of you that is lunar, just think of their relationship in an embodied way. How does that feel to you? Are they relating to each other? Are they maybe in great harmony? Are they in great tension? Are they in great inquiry? Are they avoiding each other? Or is each doing their own thing? And how does that work in your life? Do you feel a simple way to find that out is to ask the question, the sun says I want and the moon says I need. And so the sun is more related to ego and, I want this. That's the sun's drive. And the moon says, but I really know that I need this. I nurture, I hold and these kinds of things. So is what I want and what I need really the same thing? I say I want a great job, but what I really need to do is to not work, for myself. Like, so these kinds of inner conflicts, what how are those two, to start very simply, how are those two relating to each other? What are their interactions? And you can do that between any two planets, especially if they have a line between them, because then you know they're in a relationship. And I want you this week to start to explore those relationships between the any two planets on your stage that interest you. Yeah, I'm really curious about these two. It makes no sense that they have this um, that they're together because they're so different from each other. Saturn is always about contraction and focusing and mastering, and Jupiter is all about expansion and freeing. How do those work together when they're standing next to each other? What are they trying to figure out? And you start to see this complexity that goes on in a chart, these oxymorons, these no-sensical differences, and that's what makes it so interesting and so fun because we have to recognize and reconcile these tensions within us all the time. And there's almost a whole class dedicated to that skill, which is incredibly important because everyone in their chart, almost everyone in their chart, has things that make no sense because I've got this part of me that's so expansive and this part of me that's so constrictive. And how do I bring that into the same, how do I bring those two together? All I can tell you right now is that there's a price for not bringing them together, for doing one or the other, which is what most people do. And it brings upon a whole lot of suffering. Okay, here's another rule that's good to know. Um, when two planets interact, we're starting to do a synthesis here. So when two planets interact, there's a rule that the slower planet gives its energy to the faster planet. It's a general rule. So, for instance, let's take Saturn and Mercury. If Saturn and Mercury are in a relationship on your stage or anybody's stage, then the rule is that Saturn gives his, I'll use him now, gives his energy to Mercury, not the other way around. So here's what that means. You have a Saturnine, thank you, English, because we have actual words for this. You have more of a Saturnine Mercury than a Mercurial Saturn. Make sense? You have more of a Saturnine Mercury than a Mercurial Saturn because they work that way. Pluto and the moon, for example, the moon moves much faster than Pluto. So you would have a Plutonian moon, not a lunar Pluto. Sun and Jupiter, you would have a jovial sun, not a solar Jupiter. And play this game yourself because you've got the orbital speeds. I gave those to you last time, or yeah, last time. And the last thing for today is I want to talk about clusters. Very often it's not neat in a chart. It doesn't look nice and proper where you have, um, you know, uh, two planets together on one spot. You might have three planets together, or four or five. It's called a cluster. And how do you interpret that? How do you work with that? Again, it's deduction, it's feeling into it, it's wondering what that would be like. You have to develop the skills to imagine all of those actors in the same place and who might be the strongest here in that scene and why are they the strongest. You'll learn a little bit more about the strength of a planet when we talk about the signs and the planets and signs. But for now, you just want to know that there is an intensity that has to be deciphered. But certainly a cluster as a whole, just as a shape, as a form, as a concentration that we talked about earlier, is important. And we start to decipher it by looking at who's there. Again, we always ask the question, who's here? And what would it feel like when you do the embodiment? What would it feel like if those parts in me were all in the same room? Start there and then start to imagine what that might be like for the person. And sometimes you ask clarifying questions and you get a sense. When you get mad, what happens? When last time you fell in love, what was that like? Ask these kinds of questions and you start to get a sense that part of them will speak to you. The lover will speak to you. Venus will speak to you when you ask the question, what happened last time you fell in love? Or what happens when you see, when you eat your favorite food, those kinds of things. That might be a moon response as well. So you get really comfortable with starting to think archetypally and to develop this keen sense of an archetypal eye that we're all developing here together. All right, and so that brings us to the questions that I'm really curious about for this time. I really want to know how you're doing with the materials. I would love to get, obviously, any questions you have about anything is what this half hour that we're going to go into now is for. But I would specifically like to know how you're doing with the materials, how the learning is going for you, how the speed is for you. Where are you the most confused or lost? What's the most difficult thing? And one of the things I have noticed in past teachings with private students is that when we go is that the student wants to be ahead of where they are. It's so exciting. There's so much, oh my gosh, I'm starting to see things, and you start, to be what we call, knowing just enough to be dangerous. And so I'm going to remind you to go back to what we've already learned, not what we haven't learned yet. I just made the same mistake myself when I talked about Saturn, being in a sign, for instance, or a planet being in a sign. We don't have that yet. We haven't talked about planets and signs yet. We've only talked about planets and their relationships as far as charts go and interpretations go. And that's where we are. And let's go at it from that perspective. If you build this carefully and from the bottom up, then remember, I am an architect, so I'm using that kind of metaphor. If we start with a basement and solid foundation, then what you build on top of that will make much more sense than if you start with a roof. So, how much time are you spending studying? That's a good question for you. Is it enough? Is it not enough? Is it too much? Are you able to follow? When you look at a chart, is it less overwhelming now than it was before? EBIs, that's for me. Anything, I'd be happy to learn the homework. that I'm giving is, learn this. You should have this. I've given this before, but now you know why you're learning this bottom part of that sheet. And the reflection for this week is, how do I experience my inner multiplicity through my aspects? In other words, how do I know, these two love each other, but those two hate each other? Just use one example of both and reflect on that, how you experience that in your chart based upon what you've learned so far. And again, summary of this week was to understand how planets relate to each other. And this is what I hope you have learned this week when you do the homework and everything. I want you to have understanding and memorize the six aspects that we use, have a felt sense of each aspect, be able to describe orbs and what within orb means, understand aspect highlighting and the aspect rules for angles and the nodes, and explain what an unaspected planet is and what it means. Okay, that's it. And now let me get out of this. And there we are. All right, ready for questions. Oh, wait, she has to